My name is Diana, and once upon a time, I thought I was living the dream. You know the kind I mean, white picket fence, loving husband, 2.5 kids on the horizon. Essentially, a life straight out of a romantic drama. The man responsible for painting this idyllic picture was Derek. Derek. With his chiseled jawline, sparkling eyes, and effortless charm, he was everyone's dream guy, including mine. I met him during my last year in college, and it was love at first sight, or at least it felt that way. Derek was a natural romantic. He knew just the right words to say, the perfect gestures to make. Within a year, we were engaged, and a year after that, I was walking down the aisle in a flowing white gown, beaming at the man I thought would be my forever. Ready to be my wife. Derek whispered as we stood in front of the altar, his eyes shining with what I took for love. "More than ready," I replied, feeling a tear of happiness slide down my cheek. The wedding was gorgeous. We had roses everywhere, strings of fairy lights illuminating the room, and a jazz band that played our favorite songs. Our families were elated, our friends envious, and I felt like the happiest woman alive. But among the sea of smiling faces, there was one that never reached the eyes, my soon-to-be mother-in-law. During the reception, she sidled up to me with a glass of champagne in her hand and an unsettling smirk on her face. "Diana, dear," she cooed, "such a lovely event. Though you could have chosen a better flower arrangement, don't you think? Roses are so pedestrian." I was taken aback, but I kept my smile intact. "Well, I always thought roses were timeless," I said, trying not to let her see how much her words had stung. "Timeless or cliched, it's a thin line, my dear," she retorted before sauntering off to schmooze with other guests. That was the first red flag, but like any bride basking in the glow of her wedding day, I chose to ignore it. It was easier to focus on Derek's adoring gaze, the cheer of our families and friends, and the dreamy atmosphere that had enveloped the day. I convinced myself that it didn't matter what my mother-in-law thought. What mattered was the man I had just married and the life we were about to build together. Yet even as we jetted off to our honeymoon, her barbed words kept creeping into my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the glossy surface of our picture, perfect life, something was rotting away, like a little scratch on a shiny new car. My mother-in-law's attitude was a flaw in an otherwise pristine landscape. How big a flaw? I didn't realize at that time. As we touched down in Bali for what would be a honeymoon filled with sunsets and romance, I buried those nagging thoughts deep down. I was determined to focus on the good, on the love story that felt like it was written in the stars. If only I knew then what I know now, that some stars are destined to fall, and some facades, no matter how beautiful, are built on shaky foundations. After the honeymoon, life was bliss, or at least I believed it to be. Derek and I settled into our cozy suburban home, a 2-story abode with a lawn we dreamt our future kids would play on. The initial months were the honeymoon phase magnified. We were that annoying couple, always holding hands, always gazing into each other's eyes. It was, in a word, perfect. However, my career began to take off. I got promoted twice in a year, my work earning me accolades and a pretty good salary. Derek, on the other hand, seemed to be stuck in a rut. His job was steady, but unlike me, he didn't seem to be moving up the ladder. One night, during dinner, the elephant in the room decided to make itself known. Derek looked up from his plate, his eyes not meeting mine, and asked, "So, how was your meeting with the board today?" "It went well," I replied, cautiously optimistic. "They were impressed with my presentation. There's even talk about another promotion." "That's nice," Derek said, but his eyes were clouded, his smile a touch too tight. "You don't seem too happy," I pressed. "Is something wrong?" "It's just, don't you think you're getting too engrossed in your work? We hardly spend time together anymore." That comment didn't sit well with me, but I tried to diffuse the tension. "I know, but these opportunities won't come twice. We both have to make sacrifices for our future, right?" "Yeah, sure." Derek mumbled, finishing his meal in silence. The air grew thick between us, yet we carried on like everything was fine, ignoring the fissure that had just cracked open in our lives. As if picking up on our issues, my mother-in-law began visiting more often. At first it was once every few weeks, but then it escalated to almost every other day. Each visit was a calculated performance. She'd waltz into my home, critique my choice of furniture, the food I made, even the way I dressed. "Diana, dear, wouldn't you want to spruce up your living room a bit?" She'd suggest, casting a disdainful glance at my carefully chosen decor. "Something more elegant." "I like it the way it is," I'd retort politely. "It feels warm and welcoming to me." "Well, to each their own, I suppose," she'd sigh, making it clear she found my taste questionable at best. I couldn't shake off the feeling that her frequent visits and her nitpicking were part of a bigger plan. Was she trying to drive a wedge between Derek and me, or was it simply her way of asserting dominance? My gut told me something was amiss, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And so I did what I always did. I buried my suspicions, choosing to focus on the good aspects of my life, ignoring the cloud on my horizon that was getting darker and more ominous with each passing day. But you can only ignore the signs for so long. At some point, you have to face the storm. And little did I know, the tempest was about to break, shattering my illusions and forcing me to confront the painful truth about the life I had built and the people I had trusted. As time progressed, the tension in our household became palpable. My relationship with Derek became a concoction of forced smiles and pregnant silences. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law's visits became even more frequent and invasive. I would often come home from work to find her sipping tea in my living room, passing judgment on everything from my cooking skills to the cleanliness of the house. It was a strained existence. And each evening as I turned my key in the front door, I found myself praying that I would walk into an empty, peaceful home. But deep down, I knew something was brewing, a tempest in the offing. Then came that fateful evening. I decided to leave work a bit early. The atmosphere at home had been stifling, and I wanted to prepare a nice dinner to maybe alleviate some tension. As I walked through the door, I noticed that Derek's car was already in the driveway. Odd. He usually worked late. As I approached the kitchen, I heard hushed voices. The tone was not one of idle chat, but something more sinister. My pulse quickened. I took off my heels and tiptoed closer to the conversation. "You really think this is going to work?" I heard Derek's voice clearly, tinged with what sounded like anxiety. "Absolutely, darling. Your wife has become a liability. Her career is outpacing yours, and you know the kind of talk that creates." That was my mother-in-law, her voice dripping with disdain. I felt my stomach churn, a sickening realization beginning to form in my mind. "So, what's the plan then?" Derek asked, his voice tinged with a trepidation that made my heart sink further. "Simple. In 3 days, we put our plan into motion. I'll pretend to get violently ill after eating dinner here. We'll claim that Diana poisoned me." My knees nearly buckled. Were they really plotting what I thought they were plotting? "Derek, are you sure about this?" my mother-in-law pressed. "We've discussed this, Mom. I can't let her outshine me anymore. I can't let her take everything away from me. It's my turn to lead, and I want what she has." "And you'll have it," she assured him. "Once she's out of the picture, you can claim her assets. Her money will be your money, and people will finally see you for the successful man you ought to be." I felt as if the floor had been yanked out from under me. This was not a mere difference in personality or ambition between me and my husband. This was a calculated, malicious plot to sabotage me, to rob me of my life and achievements. My first instinct was to burst into the room, confront them both, and tear my marriage apart right there. But a second thought held me back. If I confronted them now, they'd just deny it, and I'd have no proof. I needed irrefutable evidence to bring them down, and luckily I had 3 days to get it. With my heart pounding in my chest, I quietly retreated, picking up my heels in my hands and tiptoeing back out the front door. I got back into my car, drove around the block, and then returned home, this time making sure to make my presence overtly known. "Hey, I'm home," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady as I walked back in. Derek and his mother greeted me with forced smiles, unaware that I had overheard their vile plot. It was a game of deception, and the stakes had never been higher. But now that I knew what I was up against, I was ready to turn the tables. They had 3 days to finalize their plot, and I had the same amount of time to unravel it, piece by damning piece. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of plotting and planning. Every moment was a ticking clock, reminding me that my world could come crashing down if I didn't act swiftly and smartly. My first move was to contact a friend who worked in law enforcement. Without divulging too many details, I explained that I suspected someone might attempt to harm me and inquired about how to collect evidence. "Wiretaps and hidden cameras are tricky due to consent laws," he said cautiously, "but you could keep your phone on and record conversations." I thanked him and mulled over the idea. Recording a conversation without consent was illegal in some places, but right now, I felt cornered. It was my word against theirs, so I decided to take the calculated risk. The day of the planned incident came quickly. I could feel my pulse racing the entire day, but I put on the facade of an ignorant, happy wife. Derek and his mother arrived around 6 p.m., the tension in the air so thick you could cut it with a knife. But I pushed forward, serving them with a bright smile as though nothing were amiss. Before entering the dining room, I surreptitiously activated the voice recorder on my phone and placed it discreetly under a stack of napkins on the buffet table. "So, shall we begin?" I said, motioning for them to take their seats. "Absolutely, darling. Everything looks wonderful." Derek smiled back, but his eyes had a glint that I now recognized as deception. I served the first course, a creamy tomato soup that I'd made dozens of times before. As they took their first spoonfuls, my mother-in-law suddenly began to choke and cough violently, clutching her chest and collapsing onto the floor. "Diana, what have you done?" Derek yelled, his eyes wide with feigned disbelief as he reached for his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No need for that," I replied, my gaze icy cold. Just at that moment, the front door burst open. Police officers rushed into the room, pointing at Derek. "Police, drop your phone and put your hands where we can see them." Derek looked bewildered, his gaze shifting frantically between me and the officers. "What is this, Diana?" As the police handcuffed him and his melodramatic mother, who suddenly seemed quite fit, I retrieved my phone and stopped the recording. "This," I said, holding up the phone, "is evidence." As it turned out, my law enforcement friend had taken my fears more seriously than I'd thought. He had kept an eye on my residence and, upon seeing my coded text that I'd sent just before dinner, had dispatched officers to my home, suspecting foul play. Derek and his mother were dumbfounded. Their plan had backfired spectacularly, and the recording was the final nail in the coffin. As they were led out of my home, their faces etched with the realization that they had lost, I couldn't help but think how swiftly the tables had turned. It was a gamble, one that could have endangered my own legality, but it was a calculated risk I had to take to expose the venomous snakes I'd been sharing my life with. Now, they were the ones facing the consequences of their actions. And as for me, I felt a sense of vindication, tinged with the bitter sweetness of a life-altering revelation. I had unmasked the villains in my story, but there was still much to be done. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The days following the arrest were a blur of legal consultations, paperwork, and emotional turbulence. Even though I had collected evidence, my heart would still race whenever I thought about the courtroom. Our entire lives would be aired like dirty laundry for everyone to see. Yet, I had to steel myself for the confrontation. When the trial began, I felt like I was stepping into a different universe. The sterile courtroom, the gravity of the judge's stare, the lawyers pacing and firing questions. It was overwhelming. My lawyer had prepped me well, but nothing could prepare me for the moment when I'd have to face Derek and his mother in court. "Diana, Is it true that you've been unhappy in your marriage? Derek's lawyer sneered, trying to paint a narrative where I would be incentivized to frame them. Unhappiness in a marriage doesn't justify criminal actions, I retorted, holding his gaze. The room seemed to hold its breath when the recording was played. You could hear a pin drop as Derek and his mother's plotting voices filled the room. When it stopped, the silence was deafening. "Derek, do you recognize that voice?" the prosecutor asked. Derek hesitated. It sounds like me, but this is a setup. She manipulated that recording. His mother chimed in. My son would never do something like this. Diana is just trying to ruin him. Then it was my turn. My lawyer asked, "Diana, how did you obtain this recording?" "I suspected foul play and took measures to protect myself," I replied, keeping my tone steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The jury took less than an hour to come back with the verdict, guilty on all counts. Derek and his mother received a 4-year sentence for attempted fraud. As the judge announced the sentence, I looked over at Derek. His face was ashen. His mother was beside herself. That night, I sat alone in the house that had once been the symbol of my marital dreams. I signed the divorce papers and left them on the kitchen table for my lawyer to collect the next day. For so long, this place had been a war zone, fraught with tension and deceit. Now it was just a house, empty and echoing, but filled with the promise of a new beginning. I got a notification on my phone. It was an email from my office. The board had decided to promote me to a senior executive role, a position that had been in discussion for weeks, but was now finalized. A position that would have probably gone to someone else had my life been upended by Derek's plot. It struck me then how close I had come to losing everything: my career, my reputation, my freedom. But instead, the tables had turned. Derek and his mother were behind bars, and I was here standing stronger than ever. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down, taking in the quiet. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. I had taken control of my story, and while the road ahead would be filled with new challenges and uncertainties, I had turned a decisive page. Derek had always told me that life was a game of winners and losers. Well, the game was far from over, but for now, I was definitely winning. Cheers to that. The divorce proceedings went by swiftly, expedited by the criminal charges that had been levied against Derek and his mother. Within a month, it was finalized, and my lawyer handed me the papers with a somber yet triumphant look on her face. "You're free now, Diana," she said, pecking her briefcase. "What are you planning to do next?" "I think it's time to write a new chapter in my life, one that doesn't include Derek or anyone else who wishes me harm," I replied, taking a deep breath as if to absorb my newfound freedom. My career blossomed in the following months. I took over significant projects and led teams to success. The company recognized my efforts, and I felt truly fulfilled for the first time in years. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the final chapter of my past was yet to be written. Derek and his mother were due to be released soon, their sentences reduced for good behavior. While they couldn't touch me legally, I wanted them to know that they had picked the wrong person to mess with. The opportunity presented itself unexpectedly. A mutual friend, a real estate agent, told me about a property that Derek had always coveted, a beautiful, isolated lake house that he'd dreamed of buying for years. But given the divorce and his tarnished reputation, it was well out of his reach. On impulse, I bought it.